And a very good morning to you. We are live in London. You're with Monocle on Sunday with me, Emma Nelson. Coming up, our Middle East correspondent joins us to talk about the latest news from the region and to reflect on the last year ahead of the anniversary of the October the 7th attack on Israel by Hamas. Then my guests, Marta Lorimer and Charles Hecker, will join me to share their views on the week's biggest stories. Good morning, Charles. What have you spotted?
From the Department of Everything Old is New Again, cassettes are back in style, so much so that people are going out and buying old cars for their cassette players.
You are kidding me. Great. We'll be then heading to Thailand for the latest headlines.
Sawadee ka, this is Gwen Robinson in Bangkok for Monocle Radio, and I'll be bringing you updates on Thailand's new young Prime Minister, as well as the resurrection of an iconic old hotel.
It's the 6th of October 2024, live from London. This is Monocle on Sunday.
Live from London, this is Monocle on Sunday with Emma Nelson.
Good morning, everybody. Autumn's arrived here in London. Let's not dwell on it. Let's talk about the good stuff. Good morning, Chuck. Charles, I keep forgetting, how many years have you been on the radio? And I don't know whether to call you Charles or Chuck on the radio. Ladies and gentlemen, we call him Chuck behind the scenes, and then he sort of steps up into this professional, polished capacity.
I suppose it depends on your mood.
Okay.
If you're angry,
Chuck or Charles today?
Well, if you're angry, you can go with Charles.
Okay.
If you're feeling a little bit more jolly, you can go with Chuck.
Let's see how that pans out in the next 60 minutes, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Marta.
Good morning.
How's your week been? Or how's your week just about to go?
So my week has been fine. It is about to go that tomorrow morning I have to wake up really, really early to start my commute to Cardiff because I start teaching.
Yes, because we haven't even introduced what you do for a living. For those,
No.
we know you as Marta Lorimer, but also lecturer in politics in the School of Law and Politics at Cardiff University. Charles, Chuck, senior partner at Control Risks sometimes, but currently just about to release a beautiful book called Zero Sum on international business in Russia. But before we sort of go to your book, Marta, there was, I think Le Figaro this morning is talking about bosses who don't know what to do about remote working. It's killing productivity, it's killing inspiration, it's killing work, says, and they've now sort of got into this really tricky situation where everybody is allowed to work from home at least 3 days a week, and bosses don't know what to do. Now, you are now upping sticks, wearing out the shoe leather, wearing out the railways to get to work. Brava.
Thank you. It's delightful. I can vividly recommend Great Western Railways as a commute. Not. No, I mean, I don't understand this whole railing against remote work, particularly because I think there are some professions that aren't particularly well suited to it. But I know that when I go in the office, I am going to be distracted because I love having people around me and I love talking to them. So when I'm teaching, I think it makes sense for me to be there. But if I have to
I think it does, yeah.
But if I'm doing research and I actually have to be reading for extended periods of time and actually thinking about things or going to archives, I can't be in the office. So I think it is quite sensible for me to actually have a part of remote work and, a part that I can just do in my sweatpants and work that actually requires me to be there.
Perhaps that's one of the few professions where actually research is something that you don't necessarily need to be sort of perky in the office to do. But we had a library. I don't know about you. Now, Charles, where did you write your book? Did you go into an office and sit down, or did you find a place that you would commute to in order to place yourself in a work state of mind?
Yeah, that's right. I tried to put a little bit of structure around the process. And so since I didn't have an office, I pretended that I had one. And I went almost every day, day in and day out, to the British Library. And I got myself a reader's card, and I went into the Humanities 1 reading room, which is the quietest place in southeast England, and also has an awful lot of books on hand if you're doing research. And so I kind of pretended that was my office. I shared it with the hundreds of people who fill the reading rooms at the British Library every day. But it was a great place to work. The British Library was then the subject of a major cyber attack and became slightly useless when it comes to getting out books and doing research, although they have now recovered from the cyber attack.
Wonderful. And you're actually picking up physical books to work?
It was an absolute delight. I mean, there are 117 million items in the British Library. I didn't read most of them, but whatever I needed to read, They delivered, it was useful, and then I put them back where they came from.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. Let's talk a little bit about what's been happening in the last week or so. Israel last night has carried out several strikes on the southern suburbs of Beirut overnight. It's being described as the worst night of attacks so far. Let's get some more details now from Monocle's Middle East correspondent, Leila Molana-Allen. A very good morning to you, Leila.
Good morning.
So just explain to us the scale and the effect of last night's attacks, please.
Last night was by far the most intense we've experienced here in Beirut. There were at least 25 strikes on and around the southern suburbs of Beirut. And just to be clear, that those southern suburbs are run by Hezbollah in terms of the fact that they are governing there. But it's not a Hezbollah area in terms of it being some sort of military barracks then. This is one of the most densely populated residential areas in the country. It's right next to the airport. It's also right next to 2 Palestinian refugee camps. Last night, the road to the airport was bombed. A huge medical facility there that had hundreds of oxygen tanks in it. So that went up in smoke in an absolutely enormous explosion, which rocked the city. There were hundreds of families in those Palestinian refugee camps, terrifiedly running through the streets, trying to evacuate as that was happening. And those strikes went on through the night till about 5 a.m. The whole city was shaking. And then at about 10:30 this morning, they started again.
What's it like being in the centre of a city which, yes, admittedly, Hezbollah takes a tremendously strong hand in the way that the city and indeed the country is run. But to all intents and purposes, as you say, this is not a terrorist stronghold. This is an international capital city.
Absolutely. And excuse me, I'm coughing because there is so much smoke in the air, and I've been to multiple strike sites over the last few days. Hezbollah is a military organization, a prescribed terrorist organization in the West, but it's also a governing organization. It has a political arm, and many of the people and facilities being attacked right now are part of that political arm. They provide social services, they provide hospitals, they provide schools, they provide ambulances. Many of their ambulance volunteers and civil defense workers who are digging civilians out of buildings that have collapsed have been killed. More than 100 health workers now killed in the last 2 weeks, 45 clinics hit, many of those not associated with Hezbollah at all across the country. The fear here in Beirut is mounting every day. Initially, what was said was that there would be limited strikes in the south and then limited ground incursions. This is what the IDF said in the south of Lebanon, in villages directly on the border. For years now, Israel has wanted Hezbollah to move back behind the Litani River, which is sort of the divide of the far south of Lebanon. And UNIFIL, which is the UN mission in Lebanon, has peacekeepers there. Israel is now asking the UN to move its peacekeepers out of the way for their own safety. They are refusing to go. So there are heavy clashes happening on the southern border, but every day the evacuation zones that Israel declares widen. They've now widened all the way up to the center of southern Lebanon. More than a quarter of Lebanon's population is now displaced, and they are spread across the country. They're living on the street. Every morning you walk out in Beirut, and there are more and more people sleeping on the street with blankets, with mattresses. It's incredibly hot during the day. It's pouring rain at night, and we're about to go into winter, which will make things even worse. This country cannot cope with this displacement crisis. And now the strikes in the southern suburbs of Beirut are also spreading to other areas in Beirut as well. And many fear that the airport could soon be struck. That's the only civilian airport in this country and the place that people are currently evacuating from.
There is a sense here that Israel is absolutely scaling up its offensive here, isn't there?
That's absolutely the case. And when they talk about these limited strikes, that's, of course, what happened first in Gaza last year, when Israel started striking Gaza after the horrific 7th of October Hamas attacks. They initially said there would be limited strikes, and those strikes scaled up. The same thing happened here in 2006. There were strikes, but already this war, other than the fact that the airport hasn't been taken out, is more extreme. Many more have died. In 2006, over 1,000 people died here. Already 2,000 people have died in just 2 weeks here. That 2006 war was a month long. Now, in 1982, Israel said, when it started striking Lebanon, that it was, again, just carrying out limited raids on the border. And within 2 weeks, the defense minister was standing in Beirut. And they then occupied the south of Lebanon until the year 2000. So people are very afraid here. They have a very long memory, and they remember that when these things happen, they escalate extremely quickly. And that does seem to be the case. In the last week that I've been here, the escalation from a few strikes a day to the city being pounded all night, every night, and the south all through the day, as well as multiple unwarned strikes in the suburbs of Beirut during the day has escalated hugely. It's very clear that the conflict here is growing.
Hezbollah also showing no signs of backing down either with its attacks into Israel.
No, absolutely not. And of course, what's important to remember here is that, for instance, the IDF issued a statement the other day when 8 Israeli soldiers were killed fighting in southern Lebanon, saying terrorists have killed IDF soldiers. That's not how those people are seen here. So Hezbollah is a group, is not seen as a terrorist organization within Lebanon. It's a political party and a military organization. One of the problems here is that the Lebanese armed forces, which is the army for the country, is severely limited in its capacity because its allies are the same as Israel's allies. Their military allies are primarily the UK, the US, and France. And the way that they arm the Lebanese armed forces is very limited because Israel does not want the Lebanese armed forces to have the offensive military capacity to be able to launch attacks on Israel. What that means is that Hezbollah has made that their excuse to fill the gap in 2006. It was Hezbollah that fought back Israel in that war. It wasn't the Lebanese armed forces. So by many here, whether or not they actually support Hezbollah's political goals, Hezbollah is seen as the defender of Lebanon and of South Lebanon because they are the group with the military capacity to do so. So when they are fighting on that southern border, for everyone here and many other people, they are defending their country. They're not terrorists fighting Israel at all. Now, of course, what they're also doing, which certainly is an offensive, is sending rockets into Israel. They're continuing to do that. All of northern Israel now is evacuated, has been for many months now. 60,000 people at least have been evacuated from there. And Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is saying that's why they're doing this now. Their primary goal now in the north is to return those citizens to the north. But Israel does have the capacity, while it's a very difficult situation, to support these refugees, these internally displaced people, within Israel. Financially, they're being put up on hotels. They have the infrastructure. Lebanon simply does not. Lebanon's been going through a horrendous financial crisis for the last 5 years. There's been a huge brain drain here. Still, the economy is in smithereens. Of course, we saw the explosion here 4 years ago that devastated the capital. The government is still a caretaker government. They do not have proper leadership here that can actually pass proper laws to be able to change the situation. So people are, as I say, literally living on the street, being helped by whatever local charities can do something, but the government is not able to stand up to this challenge. Hezbollah also is providing a huge amount of medical services and medical response for everyone injured in these attacks, not just those in their areas. And much of that Hezbollah suburb area of Beirut has now been evacuated because it's being hit so hard and so many civilian high-rises have been brought down. Hundreds of civilians dead now.
Leila, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Beirut. That was Leila Molana-Allen, Monocle's Middle East correspondent. And just listening to that, you have, it's almost an unreal picture that's being portrayed there of what is happening in Beirut, which so many of us know as being a place with its edges, but a place which manages to create an absolute amount of joy and coherence and a really good international feeling from it. This difficulty now faced by the rest of the world. I mean, just talking to you, Marta, about France. I mean, because Macron in the last couple of days did an interview with France Inter, and he said that the calls for the ceasefire in Gaza against Lebanon are not being heard. And he's saying, well, the priority is that we return to a political solution, that we stop delivering weapons to fight in Gaza. I mean, we're now talking about 2 wars here, which is, it complicates the narrative enormously, but it also complicates the way that the rest of the world reacts to it. I mean, Emmanuel Macron and France have been criticised for trying to take too much of an influence in Beirut. I remember after the explosion a couple of years ago, Macron went and was basically told to go home. But you do have this really tricky situation now where the rest of the world is struggling as much as we are, the civilians, to try and understand where to begin to stop this.
Yes, and I think it's nothing that is particularly new in a sense that I get the feeling that in international politics, the Middle East is always treated as, as the Balkans of yesteryear, this area that is always going to explode at some point and no one really knows what to do because there is no... I think what was interesting about, say, the EU's reaction to Russia was that it was very clear that there was a right stand that they could take and that pretty much everyone could more or less get on board with a few strays. But generally speaking, there was a clear idea of what should be done. We haven't really had that since the attacks last year in October, because EU member states have decided to go in different directions. So I think everyone was pretty clear in terms of attacking, condemning Hamas's attacks. But then after that, the reactions to Israel's response have actually been quite diverse. And as this drags on, I think there is more and more concern in European capitals about the proportionality of that response. And I think we're going to see something quite similar happening right now, because no one really wants another war on their hands.
It's a difficult situation. I mean, just going back to the Macron-Netanyahu, Macron called for a halt on arms deliveries to Israel. That's a very strong position. Netanyahu comes back saying these comments are a disgrace. Macron comes back saying Netanyahu's reaction is excessive and detached from the friendship between France and Israel. The most important word for me for that one was friendship. And you think, what kind of friendship can be maintained and constructed here?
The problem is that everyone is genuinely concerned about what happens if they are more forceful in their critiques towards Israel, because they know that Israel is probably their main friend in the area. And that is why they have to very much keep them on board. And I think there's also sort of domestic politics concerns, like for someone like Macron, for example, that he is going to get heavily attacked from the far right of all people if he tries to step back on that commitment to Israel.
And that friendship we have seen enormously played out between the United States and Israel, and the United States backing Israel to the hilt and sending military equipment on a large scale. And it seems to now become a situation which is playing out into US domestic politics, isn't it? This is an interesting moment in American political history where elections aren't anywhere really fought on what a foreign policy is, but this is now touching the Trump-Harris race, isn't it?
That's right. You and Leila were talking about Beirut being an international capital city in anticipation of an escalation. In another international capital city, in Washington, D.C., there's an anticipation of yet what might be a third front, you might say, or a third battle, and that is Israel's retaliation against Iran. And there are several ways that Israel may retaliate against Iran, which just a few days ago launched the largest ever ballistic missile attack in military history on Israel. And Israel could retaliate in a number of ways. They could go after military installations in Iran. They could target the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps. They could target Iran's nuclear facilities, or they could go after Iran's energy complex and after its ports and oil installations. When President Biden even suggested that there may be an attack on Iranian energy facilities, the energy markets around the world briefly went into a tailspin. And the last thing that the U.S. campaign needs right now, and it's always referred to as the October surprise, some unexpected event that happens in October that upends the campaigns, is a spike in petrol prices at the pump, which would probably play very strongly to the Trump candidacy and against the incumbents for mismanaging the conflict. And Biden very clearly said, look, we don't control Israel. And there's very little love lost between Biden and Bibi. They said, we don't control Israel, but we do our best to influence them. And everyone is waiting to see how that works out.
And no one really gets the impression that the United States' influence on Israel is what it was.
No. It's sort of borderline animosity. There has been ongoing disappointment in both the personal and the political relationship between Netanyahu and Biden. On the other hand, I suppose it's anticipated that Trump and Netanyahu would have a much better relationship. And so if Netanyahu has any, is sort of calculating on the international impact of his retaliation against Iran, one of them is whether it will move the dial in D.C.
Let's move on to another subject that you've been looking at. We've spoken right at the beginning of the program about the sort of the trade wars that we face as well. I mean, while we're dealing with hot wars, what we saw in Europe this week was a real sign that the European Union doesn't really know what to do about China. Marta, your face is just lit up going, what are they doing? This is about cars. Well, it's a lot more than cars, isn't it? This is about the future of manufacturing and what kind of European Union we're looking at in the future, isn't it? But it all boiled down to an argument about cars.
Yes, it boiled down to an argument about cars and on tariffs on electric vehicles coming in from China. But it is really reflective of a broader tension in the Franco-German couple. When we think about European integration, we say, okay, European integration functions because France and Germany agree to something and everyone else just follows them, whether they like it or not. But the problem is that in the last few years, France and Germany haven't been working together as well as they used to. And part of the reason for that is because they have very different interests. So since Macron came on the French political scene, one of the things that he's been wanting to do is to make Europe great again. We're going to call it that way. But
oh, please don't.
You had to say that.
Of course, I had to say it. Come on. Mega.
Okay, that's great. I'll go for mega.
Let's go for mega. So he's been trying to really push for more European strategic autonomy. And as part of that, he also wanted to make sure that if other countries are protecting their core industries, then Europe should be doing the same. And one way to do that is to go for a more protectionist agenda. Now, this seems to go a little bit against some of the principles of the European Union, which is all about competition and about being more open to other markets, and particularly against German interests, because, of course, Germany has a very good working relationship with China, and they sell a lot of their cars there. So this has really generated some tensions, and I think these kind of exploded in the vote this week. And it is going to be challenging, because if you don't have a functioning Franco-German couple, then European integration just pretty much stalls, and this is not the best time for it to be stalling.
One of the arguments that they used, the Germans used, was the idea that the US's imposition, I think it's 100% tariff on Chinese cars. Your eyes have rolled, Charles. You know I'm coming to you. But also we had, the likes of BMW saying, well, look, we export a ton of cars to China. If we impose tariffs on China, we can imagine what's just about to come next.
Well, precisely. It's a question of where does this all end? And while we're pulling a strand of escalation through the conversations, tariffs are one of these mechanisms that tend to have a tit-for-tat or escalatory effect. Is escalatory a word? I think I might have just made that up.
It is now. Marta's invented mega, so we're going for broke this morning.
And I think that there's a certain amount of long-term political or geopolitical short-sightedness in this rush towards tariffs. Why should everyone in Europe be imitating what President Trump is proposing in using tariffs to protect or to do the MAGA, to pull the MAGA act? Tariffs work in the same way as sanctions, and that is, while you seek to be punishing a third party, you are actually shooting yourself in the foot at the same time. And you do that in two ways. You do that by triggering escalation and blowback, and you make things more expensive for your domestic audience. And most people who analyze tariffs say that they are enormous. They can be devastating to domestic economies.
And that is incredibly difficult if you are in France, for example, and the Chinese government subsidizes the production of Chinese cars. So you get this sense that actually, this is not hurting the Chinese consumer, but it is European citizens who pay to support or to subsidize manufacturing. But looking in the long term, I know you said this is a short-term thing, Jack, but Macron mentioned this. He drew an analogy this week between the car manufacturing problem and the solar panel industry. And he said that a little while ago, a decision was made to allow the Chinese to export in great number solar panels to the European Union. And as a result, he said it killed the solar panel manufacturing industry. And he said that actually we are at a long-term crossroads here, saying, oh, is Europe a country? Is Europe...
Mega.
It's going to my head. Is Europe a group of nations of consumers, or is it a group of nations of manufacturers? And then it sort of goes right back to the point of what is the European Union for in the first place? Coal and steel. He tried to make it quite existential here, whereas the Germans were just saying, please don't do that because it'll make cars, it'll absolutely screw our exports to China.
Yeah, Macron has a tendency to make things existential and to...
But does he have good reason to in this situation?
I mean, I do think that there's an extent to which Macron has a point about what we want Europe to be going forward. But it is also hugely ironic to me to hear Macron using now arguments that sort of third world countries were making against the common agricultural policy in the past. Sort of saying, well, look, the EU is basically paying its farmers and then selling their products in our countries at a reduced price, so we cannot develop a local industry. And now Europe is in the position where other countries are behaving that way. They are, supporting their domestic industries, and Europe just doesn't do it because this is not how we function. So I think that there's an extent to which Macron is right to ask that question about what Europe should be in the future. What position do we want for European companies? And particularly so since, I think the war in Ukraine really reawakened a lot of these questions because Europe realized just how reliant it was on others. But at the same time, it is going to be very hard for himself to be heard, precisely because Germany is only thinking about Germany in the current stage. And there's not that much appetite in other EU countries to see a European Union that looks increasingly the way that France would want it to look like.
Okay. Let's move on to a story. Let's delve into the past. Let's go to Boris Johnson. You wanted to talk about Boris Johnson, Chuck. I don't know. Do you know this story has completely bypassed me? I think I've probably just gently, discreetly looked the other way. This is about Boris Johnson's book.
Here's your chance to catch up.
Thank you.
So for everybody, in addition to Emma, who may not be aware that Boris Johnson has a memoir coming out.
Oh, I'm aware.
Or is avoiding the reality of Boris Johnson's upcoming memoir. It's going to be released on October 10th, forgive me. And I do not want to turn this into an advertisement for his upcoming memoir because Lord knows he's getting enough coverage as is. But two very interesting things have happened on the eve of the release of Unleashed, which is the title of his much-anticipated book. First of all, to generate publicity pre-publication, he and his publishers have let loose a few of the tidbits from the text. And one of them is, since we were talking about the Middle East, one of them is that Boris Johnson suspected that Benjamin Netanyahu planted a bug in the foreign secretary's private loo at the Foreign Office. And it was one of these things where he's like just saying that, several days before Prime Minister Netanyahu came for a visit, this is back when Boris Johnson was the foreign minister, several days before Netanyahu came to London, the private loo was clean from bugs. Several days after he left, a bug was detected. Saying nothing more. The other thing is that Johnson has apparently, in his memoir, broken a very strict metric of royal protocol, and that is that he discussed the cause of death of the late Queen Elizabeth, and that's made quite a sensation. The other thing that's come out of the coverage of Boris Johnson's memoir, not from the memoir itself, is that Laura Kuenssberg had to cancel a BBC interview with the former prime minister because she accidentally sent her interview prep notes to the prime minister himself. And then Beth Rigby of ITV News withdrew from an interview, a book talk with the former prime minister because she wasn't allowed to record the event. And she said, if we're not doing this on the record and if you're not allowing me to record a conversation with a prominent public figure, then I'm not doing it at all.
I mean, speaking from this side of the microphone, I would completely agree with her. I mean, you never say anything. Boris Johnson should know full well what it's like to be interviewed, actually, because he's a journalist. Let's talk a little bit about legacy. I mean, you're talking about Macron there trying to be sort of existentially whatever, and Boris Johnson trying to position himself as Churchill in so many ways. It's an easy assumption to make, but he didn't do anything to try and disabuse anybody of that thought. For me, it's timing. We are one, two. How many prime ministers are we now along since Johnson? There was Truss, there was Starmer, and now we're on to Truss.
There was Sunak, and now we're on to Starmer.
Apologies, Rishi Sunak. We're on to 3. I feel as if the world has moved on. And yes, okay, it's October and we're coming up to Christmas presents. Who's getting Boris Johnson in their Christmas stocking, everybody? But one wonders where the timing is all here, because the world has moved on. There is an enormous amount of trouble and turmoil and what have you in the world at the moment. To me, this felt like very much sort of an internal Westminster bubble with all my friends book and event that lacks relevance now. And I wonder whether Boris Johnson had published his tell-all memoir about 6 months after departure, then we might actually have paid attention.
Well, I think that the problem for him was that 6 months after departure, it wouldn't have been particularly useful to him. I think what is probably important right now is that the Tories are selecting their next leader. So it is a moment where the party is trying to decide what they want to do when they grow up. So far, it's not looking great. It seems to be that they've decided that they want to be the French National Rally or something along those lines.
And there is no fresh blood in the lineup.
So I think this might be also a way for Boris Johnson to stay relevant in a moment where people are probably not going to be talking about him, and to perhaps maybe have an influence on whoever the next leader of the Conservatives is going to be. I also think Boris Johnson seems to be someone who always needs money. So that might also be
He has
part
more
of the
than one
story.
child to support.
When
Exactly.
you have
He
10
has-
kids to look after.
He has a range of children.
The reason why we're quite discreet is that there is no official number. There is an official number, but there are...
There's a confidence bracket. So there's about...
Yes. Chuck.
Another
Charles.
one of the, on the topic, Marta makes an excellent point, and that is Johnson's drive not only to fundraise for Team Johnson, but to remain relevant, to remain talked about, and to remain a potent political force, whether it's about the future of the Conservative Party or the future of his role in it. And another one of the assertions that he makes in the text of the book is that if he had stood for election in the most recent ballot, in the most recent general election, he would have won.
Of course he would.
Well, he would say that. So,
And I wish I could disagree, but honestly, I'm still flabbergasted that the Conservatives have been in power from 2010 to 2024, so...
But this is the trouble. There's no one left.
Yeah.
They put everybody they could into office because when you're in power, you use the whole team and the reserves, and then you start to go in the
Yeah, and
You
then
look
your
at the
whole
back
team
room.
messes up at some point.
Well, yes, of course.
Roughly everyone.
you knew when they were making David Cameron Foreign Secretary, they had basically just run out of people.
There was a sound of a barrel being scraped.
At the very bottom.
Who do we have that has no hopes of a future career?
And also we have those going for the Conservative leadership at the moment know full well that they will never become Prime Minister. They will be perpetually in opposition and just get thumped and ejected.
No one's ever accused politicians of lacking ambition.
There's probably a measure of what the young children today call delulu, which is the positive side of being delusional.
Delulu?
Yes, delulu. It's a term. I discovered this.
Where did you discover Delulu?
I discovered this on the internet.
Right.
And
This is a bit of the internet I have not discovered.
Yeah, no. I've read about it in the grown-up magazines that are they care about what the kids are onto. But the idea is that delulu is a way of being delusional that is sort of positive in a way, because it suggests that unless you're delusional, if you're not at least a little bit delusional, you're not going to be doing things. And that being delusional is also a way of protecting yourself.
Martin, word number 2. Well, mega isn't a word, but it's a thing. Mega and Delulu.
Along with escalatory.
Along with escalatory. This is Word Hour on Monocle on Sunday. The time in Chiang Mai is 15:35 and it's 10:35 in Zurich, 9:35 here in London. Now let's get the latest news from Thailand. Gwen Robinson is Monocle's Bangkok correspondent. A very good afternoon to you, Gwen.
Sawadee ka.
How's it going?
Well, let's just say that some things are up and some things are down. There's some cataclysmic rains and floods in northern Thailand, and the country's being fed on this diet of endless videos of really distressing scenes, particularly of drowning elephants and things like that from the north. On the other hand, Thailand has a new prime minister, as I think a lot of people have heard, a very young woman who has just made her first international appearance at a summit of sorts in Doha and is about to go into the ASEAN summit. So you've got, and there's a lot of action on tourism, soft power promotion. So it's really like everything in Thailand. It's a real mix.
Well, let's go a bit delulu on this one and see what.
Yeah, wasn't quite up. I caught the tail end of that, but that is not a popular term in Thailand yet. But I think I'll just try and drop it into conversations in the next few days.
Give it time, says Marta. Let's talk about the Prime Minister Shinawatra. That's such an interesting term to use when you realise that it's actually the daughter. And the fact is that she's just done her overseas trip, as you said. She's been in Doha. ASEAN's on the way. How is she doing, given the fact that there is this perpetual struggle that she will have to escape the chains of her father's name. But at the same time, she can obviously use her father's name as she's been able to use it as a learning ground, but also as a springboard.
Well, you absolutely summed it up. I mean, there's considerable opinion about this, and every second person, the glass is half full, and every other person, the glass is half empty. But I think everyone, there was absolute stupefaction when actually it turned out that this young woman who had never really run anything apart from part of her family business became Prime Minister at the head of an extremely unwieldy coalition. We're talking about back then 11 parties, 2 of which were military-backed and had ousted, actually full of people who had ousted her father so many years before in the coup in 2006. So a very, very dysfunctional government. And there is this young Patong Tang, or known as her nickname Ung Ing, at the helm of this fractious government. So I think overall, just reading between the lines, I think a lot of people feel, admiration that she's plucky, she's got natural charisma, she's out there. Some people wince at some of her, let's just say, more rash or unthought out statements. But overall, she's gone out there, and as I mentioned, the floods at the beginning, total catastrophe up north. She appeared very quickly, rolling her sleeves up and going around flood sites. I think that earned her brownie points. But she's got a number of, as you suggest, some very serious issues to face back home, including politics, as well as a daunting challenge of her party's promise to give every Thai 10,000 baht, which is about just over $300 in a digital wallet giveaway, which a lot of people saw as an election bribe, really, to vote for the party. But now, the reality bites and the party has to reel this out. And a lot of economists say Thailand can barely afford it. So that's a big challenge for her. But, obviously it's great for a new leader to make a first splash on an international stage. So she pops up in Doha at a very, very peculiar multilateral forum, which is called the Asian Cooperation Dialogue. This was set up with 35 countries way back in early 2000s by her father when he was Prime Minister, and went into abeyance for many, many years, revived briefly in 2016, and now suddenly, I think at Thailand's instigation, has come to life, but it's heavily focused on Middle Eastern countries and some ASEAN countries, as well as a few other countries, including Japan, but no major Western countries. And Patongtang turned up there in a pantsuit, was seen sitting in rooms full of men in Arab headdress, looking very serious and selling Thailand's virtues as both investment and also a contributing country to the region, offering Thailand as a food hub, storage centre for emergency food. They have all sorts of things, talking about its tech prowess. And so a lot of people felt she did quite well until I think she met the Iranian president, which upset, so as you can imagine, it happened on the day that Iran sent missiles into Israel. So it wasn't very well received in some circles.
Timing's not great. I mean, when you talk about Thai politics, it's one of those things that you have to remember the names of each prime minister in quick succession because they'll not be around for very long. I mean, is there a sense that she will stick about? Because what you've just said there is you've given a portrait of a very dynamic, fresh, new face on the international circuit, but domestically they're already after her scalp.
Well, you're quite right. I mean, I mentioned this problem with the financial situation and signs that Thailand's economy is not doing that well, but also there's lots of enemies out there. I mean, you can imagine in a coalition, a fractious coalition like that, there's a lot of knives out. And, the point is, I think, even the seasoned political party leaders in opposition and otherwise know that they're really treating her or regarding her, I think, as an avatar of her father, who is really the shadow shogun behind the scenes. He has all the connections. He's advising her. I mean, when she makes a speech or utters a sort of policy proposal, a lot of people think, that's Thaksin speaking. So, like you said, I think that's an advantage and a disadvantage. Thaksin has a lot of enemies, and his party, Pheu Thai, which she is now head of, has also had a lot of ups and downs. I think the main point is, in all of this, as everything in Thailand, behind it lurks, the royals and the monarchy. While it's not a direct rule monarchy, has a lot of power, and it does seem, I mean, it's not spoken, but it does seem like this current arrangement has certain kind of imprimatur from the palace, or at least, they can live with it and they're not unhappy with it. So one feels that there's been some kind of accommodation behind the scenes about this. So they may just give her full term, which would be another few years. The country then has to go to elections. But, I mean, what could happen tomorrow? I couldn't assure you.
We'll ring you if something does happen, I can guarantee it.
Do.
So let's move on finally to tourism and to hotels, something that obviously Bangkok is incredibly good at and is doing its best to improve upon.
Well, indeed, as even those of us living here who keep an eye on the tourism situation have been quite surprised at how strongly Thailand has bounced back from the absolute depths and disaster of the COVID-19 closures. I mean, they got down to just in 2019, Thailand had just under 40 million tourists, which for Thailand is huge. That was their peak. It plunged to less than 1 million, I think, probably in the hundreds of thousands. I don't know at its worst. But it looks like they're pretty well on track. The Thai Tourism Authority is saying they'll be up at 36 million by the end of the year, possibly more. They've been very clever. They've given visa-free entry to some nationalities and big extended periods of stay to everyone from the Chinese to the Russians to the Indians, you name it. Not so much to the Westerners, who they know they've got as a fairly captive audience for their tropical islands and things. So that's doing well, and I think it's really quite extraordinary to see a lot of the new hotel developments going up in Bangkok. But one of the most beloved and well known, I think, to people who've been in and out of Thailand over the years is the old Dusit Thani, which for those who've ever been to Bangkok, it was not a thing of beauty, but it had a funny little spiky hat on top of it and towered over the main entertainment area, the Silom Patpong area. And that was pulled down by the Dusit group, much to everyone's consternation, and people were very sad. And then Dusit announced it was rebuilding And everyone thought, well, what will they rebuild in its place? And actually, voila, when all the cladding came off, the little hat is there. A very sort of similar feeling is in the hotel, and they've launched with a soft opening deal that I think has really drawn people, including, the first hotel that's guaranteeing a pickup at the airport by a Porsche, one of those sort of new super duper Porsches for the top rank, staying in luxury suites and things. So,
Gwen Robinson.
I think that's a good kickoff.
Gwen, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Bangkok there. That was our correspondent, Gwen Robinson. It's 9:45 here in London. Still in the studio with me, Marta Lorimer and Charles Hacker. Marta, one of the stories you wanted to bring in was about that really difficult relationship the United Kingdom has with the European Union, that majorly angry, bitter, gruesome, grisly divorce. And now people are trying to work out how to just not necessarily get back together, but just to work out how you can actually work civilly and productively.
Yes, to cite Taylor Swift, we are never ever getting back together, but there's definitely ways to work with your exes. And I think that that's where the European Union is at, particularly in terms of its relationship with the UK. So we know that the relationship between the UK and the EU has been particularly fraught since Brexit.
Boris Johnson?
Yes, Boris Johnson, but the others didn't really help either. I'm going to say that Liz Truss wasn't particularly useful, and Rishi Sunak was. He did manage to at least get some things back on track, things like the UK being eligible for EU funding, for EU project funding. But they've been really trying to sort of rebuild a relationship of sorts. And I think Brussels was very happy to see that, to see the back of the Conservatives and see Keir Starmer and Labour come in.
And we have a story that's been bubbling around for a while. And the one that you wanted to bring our attention to was the idea that, my generation may have completely shut the door, but that should not exclude the next generation. And I don't know, you lived abroad, you've lived abroad a lot.
I have made full use of the EU's free movement.
So did I. I was on the Erasmus scheme, sent me to France for a year, and I can't remember what it taught me. It was super fun though. And your free movement for you, not necessarily a Brit or an EU member, but Charles, that joy of going to another country and throwing yourself off a cliff and thinking, where is this going to take me? It is such an important thing on so many levels, not just for personal improvement, but also for sort of societal exchange, economic exchange. It's a good thing, one would say.
Whether you use it or not, and I think all three of us took ample advantage of the freedom of movement and the ability to sort of do whatever you wanted in 27 other countries. Whether you use it or not, it's nice to know it's there. And when it's gone, you miss it. And one of the impacts of the Brexit referendum here in the UK is that it actually reduced freedom, and it took away a right. And, generally speaking, we've been living in an era of expanding individual rights and freedoms, and this was a very sharp reversal in the other direction. And I was looking at this story in The Guardian about the potential return of freedom of movement for youth. And the first thing I thought is, why are we limiting this only to young people? If it's a temporary scheme that won't permanently distort the misspoken aims of Brexit, let's open it up a little bit broader.
And there's that issue as well that in that exchange, though, what you don't want to do is let someone go and live somewhere for 3 years and they say, that's it, back you go, because that actually is arguably counterproductive to the whole scheme. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, there's a problem about how do you sell this, because I think that for younger people, you can say, well, look, when you're young, you still don't really know. Maybe you're just going to do this for a few years and then you're going to go back to your country and settle down. I think one of the problems with freedom of movement is that it is also widely overstated just how many people use it. I think the figures from a few years ago, so they might be a little bit dated, was that about 4% of EU citizens actually made use of their freedom of movement. So it's not a huge proportion of the population. Shrink that down to just young people. I don't think we're talking about huge numbers. But it is quite controversial in the UK because freedom of movement was such a big part of the Brexit debate, and this idea that, Europeans had been allowed to move here, and that had led to, a Polish takeover of your neighbourhood.
Just better gherkins. Let's talk culture for the last, 8 minutes that we've got of Monocle on Sunday. We've had Word Corner this morning. We're now going to have Music Corner, and we're going to talk about two things. We're going to talk about that retro thing that everybody loves. What was it that you described? Like, let's go back into a time capsule, Charles.
That's right. Everything old is new again.
We're going to talk about cassettes, but we're also going to talk about accordions, because this is an enormous thing that sparked tremendous joy when the suggestion was made last night that we talk about an accordion factory in France, which is a very sad story, but it's going to be fun. Where do we want to go first? Cassettes, please.
Let's do cassettes because there is a Taylor Swift strand to pull through this. And we've already talked about Taylor Swift briefly. So I was flicking through the New York Times and came across a story that said that on the back of the renaissance of vinyl, we go back another iteration, and apparently cassettes are the rage all over again. And we have, in part, Taylor Swift to either thank or blame for this, and that is that the Tortured Poets Department is the top-selling cassette of the year and has broken all sorts of sales records, although the bar is quite low. Tortured Poets Department sold 23,000 cassettes. Now, once you buy a cassette, you have to figure out how and where you're going to play it, unless you've got a Sony Walkman laying at the bottom of your backpack.
I have the equipment at home.
There you go. And so there is a rejuvenation of the portable cassette player that you stick in your back pocket and you put headphones on to listen to as you go by in your short shorts and roller skates, if we're going to go full retro. The other interesting thing, though, is
I think that ship sailed.
Be careful with...
Well, have you been to East London recently?
Yeah. Okay. That's a field trip for us three later on today, isn't it?
But the other interesting thing to come out of this story is that the last new car that was factory equipped with a cassette player came out in 2010.
Whoops.
Right. And so vintage cars are now back again in demand solely to these aficionados, solely because they have cassette players in the dashboard.
This is crackers. This is absolutely crackers. I mean, yesterday I was going through a family garage. There were a lot of cassettes in there and I didn't know what to do, but apparently that now makes me incredibly fashionable.
Yes, exactly. You can now go to a shop and sell those cassettes and maybe make some money.
Okay, there's a thought. Let's move. Thank you for that, Chuck. Let's spend the last 3 or 4 minutes of the programme talking a little bit about accordions. There's a really sad story that's going on. There's the last accordion maker in France is closing its shop after 105 years because, guess what? Competition from China. Now, Emmanuel Macron should have used the accordion argument when he was doing the China tariffs thing.
He really missed an opportunity there.
Massively missed a trick because he would have fired the French souls up into some sort of frothing frenzy. But it's a traditional French-made accordion à la bretelle manufacturing, this wonderful place in Mougins, and it's going, and it's really sad.
It is really sad, but I have to say the accordion still has its moments. I was thinking about music with accordions recently, and I actually realized Kesha released a single a few months ago called Joyride, which is a pretty epic title. And I'm pretty sure that does feature an accordion. I don't think it's a French-made accordion, though. And I think that's part of the problem. We're not talking about the accordion dying. We're talking about the French-made accordion dying. So it's a lot more about sort of local production versus being disrupted by international trade.
You went bananas when I said to you we're going to talk about an accordion, and it was amazing. Chuck suddenly started to whip songs off his phone, saying, "This is my favourite song ever," and it had an accordion in it. I mean, this
what song is it?
This struck your soul deeply, didn't it?
Guilty as charged, and I think that the soundtrack of the demise of French accordion manufacturing will be set to an accordion. Not just because it's the obvious thing to do, but because there is something well, there's accordions and there's accordions, but there is something, if we're going to talk about French accordion music, that is deeply, deeply sort of romantic and mournful and evocative and sort of gitane smoke and sort of little glasses of red wine and checkered tablecloths. And perhaps this is the sort of cliched American who, the first time he heard accordion music, found it sort of evocative of the great freedom of movement in Europe. And it's mournful. It's characteristic. It is almost always accompanied by phenomenal vocal talent.
I think you haven't listened to Kesha's single.
No, right, okay.
You missed quite a lot of accordion music. What we do have is a tiny bit of French accordion music for you from 1955. I think it's Edith Piaf's L'accordéoniste.
Son homme est un artiste, c'est un drôle de petit gars, un accordéoniste qui sait jouer la java. Elle écoute la java, mais elle ne la danse pas, elle ne regarde même pas la piste.
That's the story of the woman whose love is an accordionist and can play the java. Okay, that's the good stuff. The good stuff. I was unaware of this until I had a long conversation with Andrew Muller. Actually, it was a monologue by Andrew Muller about the number of accordion jokes that are out there. That I did not realise this, but there is a genuine hatred for accordion music out there.
Yes, I think it's considered as unserious. This is how I heard it defined on a podcast. And I kind of, when you think of the sound of the accordion, I understand why that would be. I mostly associate it with Eurovision songs.
I associate it with it being really badly played by people on the street.
That too.
In the afternoon. And I think that's where it's all gone a little bit wrong. So I'm going to regale us all with a couple of accordion jokes as we pap through this. A man parks his car in a rough part of town with 2 accordions on the back seat, forgetting to lock the back door. When he returns, there are 3 accordions. You love accordion music. You, Marta, you were talking about Balkan accordion music.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Balkan music, and they use the accordion a lot in an unserious way. So I grew up around accordions because my grandmother I think she had 4. My cousin...
Did she own that car?
Maybe. Maybe. No. She also had a viola, which is another instrument that there are jokes about. And one of her friends played the bagpipes. So I think I grew up in a family with a lot of unpopular instruments in it. We're a very musical family. My grandmother played in an Irish folk band, and she's Italian. So, this is what we're talking about. But yeah, I quite like the sound of an accordion. It can be both quite fun and really dramatic. I think it's got range.
Which leads me neatly to my next joke. How is playing an accordion like throwing a javelin blindfolded? You don't have to be very good to get people's attention. Chuck, are you gonna like pick up the accordion and save it for us all?
I'm going to play some accordion music in my headphones as I walk out of the studio this morning, just in tribute to the French accordion manufacturing sector. I guess I'm a fan of the serious accordion. And not so much the sort of wedding singer accordion or the sort of the accordion player on the street. We kind of end as we began, and that is that this appears to be the way of the world, and that it is competition from the Chinese accordion manufacturing sector that is doing in the French. Perhaps it's time to slap protective tariffs on Chinese accordions after we do that to Chinese electronic vehicles. What I've got on my phone, what I've got on my Spotify list is going to stay there.
Okay.
Is this the right moment to say that I did have not one, but I think 2 accordion players at my wedding?
My goodness, that must have been a heck of a wedding. Unfortunately, we have to leave it on that cliffhanger. The warmest of thanks to all my guests, Marta Lorimer, Charles Hacker, Gwen Robinson and Leila Molana-Allen. The programme was produced and studio engineered by Mariella Bevan. I'm Emma Nelson here in London. Monocle on Sundays back next week. Goodbye. Thanks for listening. Have a great Sunday.